Jigna, I have to read your intro about yourself because this such lovely things I want everyone to know. You are really inspiring, man. Woman, I must say. So, okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Professor Jigna Desai, though she really has to present a paper in the noon session, we are making up for time, and she comes in the place of Kanika Mandal, who's trying to connect, but she has some network issues. Professor Desai's paper title is Documenting Material Culture. Documentation is the first duty of any museum, any collection. Recording and documenting material culture is at the core of heritage, conservation, archaeology, and museum studies. This material could range from textiles, jewelry, archaeological remains, structures, remains of the built environment, and a range of other objects and artifacts. Her paper draws from various projects done at the Center for Heritage Conservation, CEPT Research and Development Foundation, Ahmedabad, to look behind the various techniques of recording and documentation. The paper examines how the methods of documentation influence the information we collect, how interpretation frameworks then can be applied to these methods. The paper would also explore ethics of documentation from field data collection to curating and interpreting, and move towards asking questions such as how do new digital technologies influence the information we collect? What are the opportunities of interpretation, curation do these technologies offer? How would research for museum curation change in the digital world? This is about the synopsis of a paper. But how come I'm missing your brief CV? Did you send that to me? 1 minute, I'll go back to your. Sorry, you're mute. Are you muted?
Yeah, I was just saying it's absolutely all right if you're missing my CV. I'll just quickly introduce myself and then we will be good to go.
No, you're not running out of time. Let me do it. Let me do the honors, Jigna. Did you send it to me? How come I can't find it? Okay, a very brief one, but I'll say that. If I missed out anything, you have to fill in.
Yeah.
Dr. Jigna Desai is a professor of Faculty of Architecture, CEPT University. She is the head Center for Heritage Conservation, CEPT Research and Development Foundation. And you can share the rest, Jigna.
Yeah, so I do have a part of my presentation. I do talk briefly about my background for the very simple reason is that I am, it's kind of the various things that I've done in past that has brought me where I am. So I'll share my screen. That's seen, right? So
yes.
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about documentation of material culture. Essentially, the way I want to define material culture here is that the tangible aspects of the cultural heritage that we work with, the material that we work with, and a large part of it, like it is also mentioned in the field of archaeology and the field of anthropology, is the built environment and the evidence of the way we live, way we have lived in past, and the kind of cultures that have produced the work or the architecture that we have. So our domain essentially where we work is to do with built heritage. And a part of that, a large part of that is to create a repository of that built heritage for further research or further analysis and further discussion. We are not directly related to creating narratives or creating museums, but we do the background work that can then help museums to be, or that can help interpretations and research and further analysis to be done. So a brief background, I'll talk about myself very briefly and my work essentially. I'm an architect by the background. So you'll see on the extreme right is some of the projects that we also do. And the projects that I work on are as a part of the office. It's very rare. It's once in a while that I get to work on a project, but these projects are also heavily influenced by the ethic of conservation, by the ethic of understanding the material and the culture of the place. So the example that I'm showing on the extreme right over here is a site where there was a very interesting landscape which was being eroded by the river. And there was a person who had a land over there and wanted to build a house there. And we constantly kept on wondering, how does one make sure that we are making a house for this person, at the same time preserving the nature, preserving the land, making it in a way that we are not dilapidating the place. And that is the, I think, ethic of conservation with which we also work in architecture. So you can see that the way the design is made is that if A, it's a small footprint, and B, that entire building can be, that it can be dismantled from the site if at any point of time the house is not required over there, and the land can go back in its original condition. I, of course, engage in research on heritage conservation, and one of the research that is very close to me, extended, which extended my PhD into this publication on equity in heritage conservation, where I look at this idea of how can heritage conservation be a unifying factor rather than a dividing factor. How can we introduce the idea of equity, that heritage conservation can become not a tool, but it can become a resource. It can become a cultural resource through which we can talk about diversity, talk about ourselves, use it to understand cultures of our fellow human beings. And I take Ahmedabad as a World Heritage City as a case study here. And I would like to evoke this idea of World Heritage here, which says that one of the reasons why the World Heritage Convention was set up is to say that if in a very nutshell, that if we understand each other's culture better, we will not destroy each other. And it was from that spirit that this entire Convention of World Heritage was also set up. A lot of my work also has to do with documentation. Some of it comes out as publication. So there's a CEPT press publication, which is documenting Serampore, which is the work that essentially the work that I guided with my students of documenting a very interesting diverse cultural heritage also of Serampore, which was a Danish colony for some time. And that photograph of the building is the Faculty of Architecture, the School of Architecture, at least it's used to be called. And we recently, last year, finished the conservation of that building. So that is also the area that I work in. So a lot of that I say is influenced by all this diverse work that is informed by all of this. I'm situated in CEPT University, professor of Faculty of Architecture over there. CEPT University is recognized as the Center for Excellence by Government of Gujarat. And I think recently also one of the 5 institutes that were identified by the Government of India as well. A very kind of the reason why I have this over here is to say that there are 3 areas. So CEPT University is this complex kind of octopussy organization, but there are 3. So you see two blue boxes over here. The blue box on your extreme left is a master's program that are run in Faculty of Architecture, masters in history and architectural history and research, and masters in conservation and regeneration. These are the 2 masters that, as a part of their educational engagement, focus on documentation, focus on understanding cultural heritage, focus on understanding histories of humankind through architecture. The methods that I used is hands-on, getting into the sites and working with them. The middle box is CEPT Archives. So I'll briefly talk about that because it's at CEPT Archives where a lot of this documentation past documentation is preserved, it's stored, and it's made accessible for whoever wants to do further research is. And that red box is our Center for Heritage Conservation that I'm heading. And I will be talking a little bit more about that center. And basically, these are the three sites where we deeply, at CEPT University, where we deeply engage with the question of cultural heritage. Coming to CEPT Archives. CEPT Archives has many different collections by contemporary architects, collections of architects whose offices are not there anymore. But I think what is relevant here is the collection of CEPT Archives that is there for that hosts students' measure drawings. And CEPT University has been different programs have been doing measure drawings of historic sites since 1965. The institute was established in 1962, and since 1965, we have earlier on we had related study programs. Now we have the master's programs and summer winter schools that engage in measure drawings. CEPT Archives has, so each of these unit you see is a collection of measure drawings of that particular monument or that particular village or that particular site. So you see that it is the range of the Kassiar village study having 94 set of drawings and stepwells with a couple of drawings. There are more than 120 such sites that are documented and are just now preserved. The documentation is just now preserved at CEPT Archives. Why, as Kedareshwari ji already mentioned, why is this documentation important? One is, of course, that this is where we start. This is the background, this is the backbone of what we want to explain and what we want to talk about. But I'll tell you a very interesting example that in 2018, after the floods in Kerala, there were certain villages that were completely flooded, and the houses and the vernacular buildings of that place entirely gone. Or while there were certain elements post-flood that were found, there was no documentation that suggested how was it coming together. Of course, there are ways of on-site studies, but at that time, ICOMOS India just floated out a query saying that does anybody have any documentation of these regions of Kerala? And I remember that, yes, in 1990s, there was a study by a group of students, and that should be in archives. And we were able to pull that out. We were able to share. And it was kind of a very important resource for the group of people who were rehabilitating the villages, and in that process, recognize the material culture or the cultural heritage of the place through the documentation that was available in the archives. So I think from that point, from various point of view, from the point of view of post-disaster reconstruction, from the point of view of interpretation, from the point of view of conservation, all these, the documentation ends up being the first stage. And at CEPT Archives, this is one thing that we do. This is an example of Dechepung Monastery in Thimphu, where the level of drawings that are available that the students have made and guided, of course, by professors. This one is guided by Professor Jigna Desai, whose documentation work, once again, is quite phenomenal, and his own personal collection of the documentation that he has done is quite phenomenal as well. And we all studied under teachers like that, teachers like Professor Jigna Desai, Professor Vasavda, for whom Professor Chaya, for whom the first step to understanding architecture, the first step to understanding culture, the first step to understanding a place starts with documenting it with deep engagement. We would stay in these places and document the architecture, the processes. You can also see some drawings where we are where there's the studies of how the construction came together, etc. So now I'll come to the center, and there is so that the CEPT Archives hosts everything that is produced that is valuable by the students in the process of their education. We have this Center for CEPT Research and Development Foundation, within which there are various centers that all of them working with built environment of different aspects. Center for Heritage Conservation specifically looks into this idea of cultural heritage. And these are our key activities. Our first and foremost activity when we started our center in 2019. And the first activity, we realized that while there is, as it has been mentioned in the past 2 days, that we have a very rich cultural heritage, and what India has is unparalleled. On the other hand, we have very little documentary evidence of what exists. So of course there are museums, there are monuments, but there is a lived cultural heritage that was also presented in the morning. And very little of this is documented and available as a repository. So the first objective that we started, it's just a 5-year-old center, so we are at the beginning of this, but we want to create a repository of knowledge on heritage conservation in India. We engage in research projects that advance this knowledge in the Indian context. We advise governments, local bodies, and industries. We offer short courses and for the continuous professional development of policymakers, practitioners, and implementers, and initiate actions that can become platforms for engaging all stakeholders and right holders in an informed discourse for heritage conservation. Before I get into our documentation unit, we basically have 4 areas within this. The first is the material studies program. We have a laboratory where we look at historic building materials with due permissions. We collect samples. We test those samples to understand what is the character of the material. There are a couple of myths that are broken for us through the process of these studies. For example, we always assumed that in the historic city of Ahmedabad, the mortar is lime mortar. But through different studies, and after having tested more than 80 samples from historic city of Ahmedabad, we realized that it's only the monuments that also use lime mortar only in its outer surface. The inner surfaces of the monuments, so the inner volumes of the monuments, walls of the monuments, and the houses that are there, the beautiful wooden houses that are there in Ahmedabad, they predominantly have mud mortar with a limited amount of lime. Now, why is this study important? The study is important because every time we are conserving a building, we by default, for the longest time, we were specifying as conservators, we were specifying cement as a material that will, for conservation, even archaeology specified cement. We moved to lime. But lime mortar is also a stronger mortar than the mud mortar. When we repair the mud mortar buildings with the lime mortar buildings, we are creating differential behavior in the building, which will actually deteriorate it further. So we do these studies. Of course, this is also an educational program. There's students benefit of it, but we have just now a kind of an archive of more than 150 material samples from wooden buildings of Gujarat, stepwells of Gujarat, monuments of Gujarat that we have studied and we have archived. We are in the process of making this public now. So that is one step towards making this, in a way, this is a documentation of the characteristics of materials that are there in the historic building, and us becoming the repository that anybody can, conservation architects or researchers can look into and study. We have a site school program. A site school program, I can take an entire half-an-hour session just on the site school program, but this program is where we collaborate with custodians of heritage sites which are abandoned, and specifically which are abandoned, because if they are just left the way they are, then they are going to be, they will dilapidate and they will collapse. So, and that they are endangered. So we collaborate with the custodians, and we constantly do our capacity building activities at these site schools. In that process, we have in 2 site schools out of the 4, we also have a 5th site school now. But in these 2, in the 2 site schools, Tangsharni Pol Masjid and Kalidas Jetabai House, we have managed to generate enough interest of the owners, of the custodians. For Kalidas Jetabai house is now half conserved. So the owners, the custodians got enough interest in it to say that, okay, we'll find funds, let's conserve this. It's halfway through conservation. And even the conservation process, every step, if we are involved, it's an educational process. So there'll be workshops, there'll be students coming here, there'll be contractors getting trained here, there'll be masons getting trained here. Tangsharnipur Masjid has just approved the funding. So that process will start there as well. So this is another initiative that's very close to our hearts, and it has its own website. So if you want to go and check that out. We have assessment and training. So we do heritage impact assessments. We do training on documentation. We do training on non-invasive testing methods for historic building. And we also have research and advisory projects. So we use all this information that for all the capacities that we have to also advise governments. But now coming to our documentation program, we started our journey. So as you can see, we have a deep history of measure drawing historic buildings. But in 2019, 2020, we got introduced to the documentation center at Nottingham Trent University, and together we got fund where they would train us in digital technologies, digital documentations. The purpose was very specific at that time, that how can we use the digital documentation to aid post-disaster reconstruction. And once again, that's an entire project that can be discussed, but that helped us create a documentation unit within our center. Based on that capacity, we applied for another large grant at Oxford Brookes University to document the endangered wooden heritage of Gujarat. So the wooden Havelis of Gujarat that many of you know are beautiful, and we got a healthy grant to document them. I'll very quickly show this video that will give us an idea of what we are doing with that, and then I'll move on to some of the conclusions. As the sound of the Give me a minute, there's an echo, I need to sort that out. Is this good?
As a part of the Endangered Wooden Architecture Program, our project documents the wooden Havelis of Gujarat. These wooden townhouses from the westernmost part of India are excellent examples of how the local construction techniques responded to the availability of wood, which was brought here through trade. These Havelis are extremely diverse. Construction details and the ornamentation on elements are evidence of the craftsmanship that developed here from the 11th century onwards. Our first step was to identify and locate the structures through extensive reconnaissance surveys. These identified structures were then recorded in individual formatted sheets. Each sheet contains the location coordinates, notes, a plan of the structure, photographs of the structure, and the table of indicators. The indicators served as our selection criteria for further detailed documentation. We made these decisions on the basis of the extent of timber use and whether it was used for the structure itself or for ornamentation only. We also considered the complexity of the use of timber, whether the joinery was sophisticated or basic, and whether there was extensive or minimal ornamentation. Another criteria for selection was whether the structure was safe and accessible. We proceeded then to take the due permissions from the The CFC team completed the training session in February 23 with Rob Kasab, a field capture specialist from SIAP. The training focused on learning and practicing photogrammetry, photography, and 3D LiDAR scanning. It also covered the integration of different data sets in reality capture software to generate 3D outputs and optimization techniques. Field data collection started with a survey of the site with the intention to understand the site context, expanse, accessibility, and movement patterns, both inside and outside the structure. Following which, a digital data collection strategy was planned on schematic layouts. We determined the number of scans needed, their locations, and the areas for photogrammetric data collection through these layouts. A feasibility check for drone flights was done based on operation range and tree covers. The sequence of data collection was planned to ensure the safety of team members, safeguarding equipment, and the convenience of residents. This extensive documentation of the wooden Havelis of Gujarat, by providing the base data for researchers, will enable analysis of the cultural influences and production processes in the long run. It has, during our surveys, triggered the curiosity of the owners and the inhabitants around these structures. In one of the cases, the documentation immediately after it was done was utilized by the owner to repair his wooden staircase structure.
Yeah, so I'll move on to the, so that was our process of documenting, which is, we are in the last stage of organizing that information and putting it out there in public domain once again for anybody to access. So this will be the documentation of over 60 structures and the photo documentation of more than 270 wooden houses of Gujarat will be available for everybody to see. We also do training programs for professionals.
Sorry, Jigna, can you be louder? It's
Oh, sorry.
yeah.
Yeah, can you, yeah, is that,
Yeah, now we are, yeah, and now we are fine.
So what we also do is that one of the things that was what I was talking about, this ethics of documentation, that we realized that while we were doing manual documentation, you are sitting and you are drawing, and you whatever you're producing is right out there for everybody who is passing by to see. And in that process, the house, whoever houses you're documenting, or whichever community's data you are collecting, they know what you're collecting. They see it. It's right there. And the editing happens right then. So at many times people would come and say, can you not show this in your drawing? This is personal to us. For example, and also when you're drawing, you kind of exercise a certain editing. So you don't draw people's personal belongings when you are making a drawing of of architecture or a joinery or a building. But when we are doing 3D scanning, it scans everything. It doesn't kind of discriminate between what is private information, what is public information. So what we do is that once we have documented, we first take it to especially the women of the houses, women custodians of the buildings, because each of, as we know, many of these structures are, and especially houses, are gendered, have gendered occupations. And in a couple of situations, there are women who come and tell us, can you not show this part of our kitchen to anybody? Because, well, even the men of the house don't know what happens here, and we value that privacy. So in that cases, we kind of create a wireframe, not show the details. After all of that, what we also do is we take this documentation back to the community. We will do exhibitions. We will do a Young Heritage Explorers program that is led by Gauri Bharat, who is an architectural historian at the university. And in that process, of course, that's this, what we were discussing earlier, also this question of awareness, but also in a way, this is where we actually enhance our understanding of the place, where many people will come to us and tell us what every place means, what every detail means, how does it get constructed, why one area is accessible and another is not. So there is a lot of this, and this is where I think some of our we are currently preparing the ethics of safety, ethics of putting a lot of this documentation together. Once again, will be publicly available. But the idea is that digital documentation presents many new challenges that we need to address before we kind of wholeheartedly embrace it. This is one of the exhibitions that we had done in the village of Bela in Kutch, where uh, it kind of, we were supposed to end at 5:30 before, when it was sundown, but people just kept on coming, and it went on for a very long time. We are, as I said, we do training programs, but I think one of our recent workshops, which is, and once again, very important in the area of digital preservation or digital documentation, and connected to the question of equity that I work with, is that one is that while it makes this data accessible to researcher more easily, documented data accessible to researchers more easily, but it also creates certain kind of divide, because not everybody can afford the softwares that can download the data. So how do you preserve this digital data in a way that it is more accessible, that everybody with, maybe, I mean, in India, almost, and even in our field studies, we find that almost everybody has a mobile phone or smartphone. how do you transfer this data in a way that we can send it to the mobile phones of people whose houses they are, and how can that be more widely circulated? So these are the discussions that we are having on how does this not once again become this space of highly expertised elitist space where only a few people have access. So these are some of the discussions that we are having at the moment. And also then how do you preserve this data? Considering that softwares change every year, hardwares become redundant, the floppy disks that we first were introduced in 1990s, no computers have floppy disks anymore. We don't know how to use them. So how do we store, how to take the data from floppy disks or even CDs now? So how do we store this data in a way that it is future accessible in future, that the redundancies of softwares and hardwares don't make this data absolute obsolete. So for example, drawings are there. Drawings from 1965 we can still access. Can we access a digital documented data 100 years from now, and how do we ensure that? So those are the discussions that we are having at the moment. We should soon have a policy for it. Once again, we will make sure it is public. Yeah, that's the end of my presentation. That's my team. We have fun while we do what we do. So this is we're a team of very young people as well. So I'm the oldest person in my team. So yeah, that gets us keeps us on our toe with new challenges, new ideas, and at the same time asking questions of what does it mean in terms of future accessibility? What about 100 years from now? Because each one of them is asking that after 50 years, if I come back, uh, what will I do with this data? A question that none of us ask, because after 50 years, we're not going to be around. So I think a lot of it's the young team that is there at CHC that drives a lot of these questions and a lot of the criticality at the center. And I think that's it. I'll end the presentation here. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing. Thank you.
I think, Jigna, you really did a marvelous job. Your presentation itself was your briefing about yourself, the way you're going about it. It's fantastic. This
Thank
always worried me. I
Yeah.
think this American Foundation in Delhi, they also do a lot of conservation of digital and bromides. It's some American, I forgot the name. So this reminded me of that, but they are heavily funded, so they're able to maintain the temperatures and all.
Yeah.
And for you, how do you maintain your? How do you told us that you do preserve the digital thing, but how do you
Yeah.
maintain your temperatures? Do you need temperature control and all for that?
Yes, we do need. So we've identified one area where our servers are,
Ah,
and we need temperature control of that area. Of course, summers of Ahmedabad are terrible.
hmm,
So it's not just the temperature control of the data we store, but even at the
ah,
time of document,
hmm,
the scanners and the cameras, they fail beyond the 40 degrees temperature. They just they become too hot to operate. So not just the preservation, even the collection of data we have to organize differently in different seasons. So in summers, we practically, because the sun rises early, the day starts early, in summers when we have to collect information, we start at 6 in the morning, we stop at 11 because you cannot operate those equipments beyond 11. We start again at 5:30 and we stop at 7:30. So that is one thing that we have to do. And the other is that within our center, we have one area where this is stored, and it's temperature controlled. And yes, you're right, funding is always an issue. Thankfully, at present, we are funded. So it is something that we are also worried about in future, that there has to have to be continuous funding for this kind of maintaining of this data. But what in this digital preservation, we learned three things. We learned one is that you don't preserve data just at one place. You have to preserve it
yeah, yeah,
minimum at three places.
yeah.
Uh, Second is that, and each one of them will have to be in different places. So that is where these collaborations matter a lot. So we have this collaboration with Oxford Brookes University. So one part of this data will always be stored there. And the other thing is that the one copy of this data, it will always have to be printed. So there are PDFs, printable formats that will always have to be there. Of course, cloud store, the raw data cannot be printed. For the raw data, what we also learned is that we will always have to maintain one large computer or kind of heavy duty computer that will not be connected to internet. Their softwares will not be updated. And it is on that computer that the raw data will always be stored. So it's not just the data, but an entire computer will have to be preserved for it to be accessible, for the raw data to be accessible in future. So these are the lessons that we are also learning in this process, because this responsibility, of course, this gives us the kind of access that is unparalleled. Our measure
Yes.
drawings, physical measure drawings, it's kind of a very tedious, only if you know that it exists that you will find it. Or whereas this is kind of more open access, it's more democratic in terms of how it can be accessed, but it's not as future proof as physical drawing. So we are kind of working on that as we go.
Who holds the IPR?
Who, pardon?
Who holds the
The copyright, yeah. So that's a very interesting question. We have actually have an agreement with Oxford Brookes where the copyright of this is held by three people. Usually the standard thing is that it is held by the funding
agency?
organization and the producing organization. So the two thing. But we have in this case also discussed, and Oxford Brookes had readily agreed that the free copyright of using this will also be with the owners of the houses. So we share the data with the owners, stuff that they can open and they can access. This kind of also gives this challenge to us, that how do we curate this data so that it can be shared with the owners with their simpler systems. And they have free copyright to use it in the way that they want. Because if they in future want to conserve their buildings, they don't have to come back to us. They don't have to come back to Oxford Brookes. They should be able to use their data to conserve their houses if they are private buildings. So it's a three-part copyright that we have developed for these projects. And
So
that's
this
been, sorry.
yeah, continue.
So I think that is the ethic that we want to also follow as we go. And yes, if you were asking about, I think you used the word students, the students who work on it, if it is a drawing that they have produced, or if it is a part of information that they have produced, they also hold that copyright. So
Yeah,
everybody who
that's
produces it
yeah,
holds it.
I wanted to do that.
Yeah.
And then, if are these all registered under the by the Heritage Committee of Gujarat?
No, not the houses are not actually,
Not registered.
very few are. So I think there are the ones in Ahmedabad that we are documenting are of course registered. There are a few in Baroda that are under Archaeological Survey of India, State Archaeology. There are the ones in Vadnagar are registered, but other than that, they're not. So these are all unprotected buildings. So
At any time, point of time, they can demolish it if they want.
they can be. In fact, there were three buildings in Patan that we request. They were, when we visited, they were on the verge of being demolished. And one of the team members, Satvika, she requested them, can you wait for a month? Let us at least document it, because they're not legally protected. You can't force them to preserve the buildings. And they waited for us. We have documented them. After documentation, one of them has decided to not demolish it. So we
They
consider that
understand the
as
importance. Yeah, they
a
understand.
little achievement of ours, that
Yeah.
they saw the value in their buildings. But
Are they paid
um,
anything, the owners?
the owners, no, because they're not active part of producing the information, but they get all the information that is produced.
That is free. Free of cost, they get
Yeah.
the information. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is some questions for you in the chat box. If you
Yes.
just
This all hope all the material is part of the disaster recovery system that IT data companies can help with. So we are in touch with GSDMA, Gujarat State, the Institute of Disaster Management of Gujarat, where we share this information with them that they can use in the time of disaster. They can access all this, and so they have all the information. Can also private agencies collaborate with you for these services, such as technology-based documentation? I think as an institution, we do not provide services. We will provide training. So if somebody wants to get trained for such documentation, we'll be very happy to. We will also be happy to kind of lend our resources for such documentation under this one condition, that they then be available as a part of our open repository. So if in past there have been situations where owners come to us saying, or private firms come to us saying that, will you document this structure for us? And we would say, as long as you allow it to be part of the open research repository, and it is a heritage structure, we are open to that as well.
Well, if I can just add something interesting, historical. Raja Deen Dayal was the royal photographer of the Asad Jah dynasty. Asad Jah dynasty, if you remember the Nizam jewels, they were on display in Delhi and Hyderabad. So I'm just, from known to unknown, I'm taking you, just Asad Jah dynasty. And the seventh Nizam, during his time, was the richest person. And his son, his father, sixth Nizam, appointed this royal photographer. So today, whatever documentary evidence, photographic evidence we have of the cities, of the Hyderabad dominions means it was present Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, Karnataka. It's a vast area. And he would travel on a bullock cart with his photographic equipment. And and go to these historical sites early in the morning, maybe 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock, and wait for the correct sunlight, and then photograph. I'll share some of the photographs when I can with you. Just see the quality, and they can be they don't pixelize. I have expanded these for some exhibitions for about 10 to 20 feet.
Wow.
Not pixel. It's all glass slides.
Yeah.
Last time. So just I shared this because you're doing so much with photography. So that's it.
Thank you.
And I don't know how to thank you. Any more questions, please?